I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Can I just say how glad I am to be at this inquiry, and how sorry I am for the pain and the loss and the suffering
sit down.
Of
please,
the
stop.
COVID victims.
Please sit down. Please sit down, or I'm afraid you'll have to leave the hearing room. I'm sorry, if you don't sit down, I'm going to ask the ushers to get you to leave. Right, ushers, please, could you ask them to leave?
Could I say, by your leave, that I understand the feelings of these victims and their families, and I am deeply sorry for the pain and the loss and the suffering of those victims and their families. So many people suffered, so many people lost their lives. Inevitably, in the course of trying to handle a very, very difficult pandemic in which we had to balance appalling harms on either side of the decision, we may have made mistakes. I don't want to try to anticipate the discussion, which I'm sure we will get into, about the timings of MPIs, of lockdowns. Inevitably, we got some things wrong. I think we were doing our best at the time, given what we knew, given the information I had available to me at the time. I think we did our level best. Were there things that we should have done differently? Unquestionably, but you know, I would struggle to itemize them all before you now in a hierarchy. I'm afraid. I think it would be. I'd find it easier to try and explain what happened as we went through.
You say in your witness statement, I unquestionably made mistakes. Can you draw a distinction for us, please, between yourself personally and the government? To what extent do you accept personal responsibility as opposed to accepting it on behalf of your administration?
So I take personal responsibility for all the decisions that we made.
Why do you think that we had the rate of excess deaths in this country that we did ultimately have?
As I say, I think that the statistics vary, and I think that every country struggled with a new pandemic, and I think the UK, from the evidence that I have seen, was well down the European table and obviously even further down the world table. If I had to answer why I think we faced particular headwinds, I would say it was irrespective of government action. We have an elderly population, extremely elderly population. We do suffer, sadly, from lots of COVID-related comorbidities. And we are a very, very densely populated country, the second most densely populated country in Europe, and that did not help.
Do you accept that government actions materially contributed to that outcome? It wasn't just a matter of the state of the healthcare system, density, age of population, and in fact the geographical location of the United Kingdom.
Given that other countries have excellent healthcare systems and face similar problems and ended up in statistically with more excess deaths per 100,000, the answer is I don't know. I don't know.
You're obviously extremely well aware of the argument that the lockdown decisions themselves, cumulatively and individually, contributed to the number of excess deaths. What do you say to that?
I say that I don't know, but I'm aware of the arguments that are made.
In his witness statement, Michael Gove has said that the wider cabinet was brought into decisions at times too late and too little. Mr. Javid has said in his witness statement that the cabinet was designed, in his view, to place Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister as the decision makers, to centralise power in Number 10. And in his own witness statement, Mr. Cummings has said that the cabinet was largely irrelevant to policy or execution on account of the leaks, your inability to chair it, and because it was seen by Number 10 as not being a serious place for serious discussion.
I don't think that's true. I think there were some really excellent cabinet discussions about the trade-offs. If I had to make a comment about cabinet as a whole in terms of the speed of lockdowns, which was what we're talking about, I think it probably would be fair to say that the cabinet was, on the whole, more reluctant to impose MPIs than I was. That wasn't true for every member of the cabinet, but that would be a general comment.
The lockdown decision of the 23rd of March 2020 was debated, as you rightly say, at great length on the Sunday, on the Monday by the various bodies, but in particular COBRA. But it was debated in COBRA on Monday the 23rd. A public announcement, we'll all recall, was made that day, that evening in fact, and then it went to Cabinet on the Tuesday. So in relation to the first lockdown decision, it's obvious that Cabinet debated it after the event. In relation to the second lockdown, that of November 2020, Mr. Johnson, do you recall whether or not that decision was made by a COVID ministerial committee or by Cabinet?
I'm afraid I can't remember the sequence there, but just picking you up on the first lockdown, which was actually a sort of crescendo of measures, I'm fairly certain we had a long cabinet call at least to discuss it.
Well, we'll look at that in detail later. When you made that announcement, you also said that this process will place the state's actions under the microscope and the government would be required to disclose all relevant information. In light of those words, could I just ask you, please, to confirm what your approach has been to the disclosure of your own COVID-related emails, WhatsApps and notes?
I've done my best to give everything of any conceivable relevance.
Has that always been your position, Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Could we have 265619, please, page 68? This is a WhatsApp between your former Permanent Secretary in Number 10 and then latterly Cabinet Secretary and your principal private secretary, Simon Case, and respectively Martin Reynolds. And the Cabinet Secretary said the Prime Minister is mad if he doesn't think his WhatsApps will become public via the COVID inquiry. He was clearly not in the mood for that discussion tonight. That date, the 20th of December 2021, was just 5 days after you had in fact appointed Milady as the chair of this inquiry. Was there a debate at that time within government as to whether or not your WhatsApps should be disclosed? And if so, whether or not they would become public by virtue of their disclosure in this process?
I don't remember the conversation to which the Cabinet Secretary is referring, and I've handed over all the relevant WhatsApps.
The inquiry has indeed requested all the key COVID-related texts, WhatsApps and so on from January 20 to February 22, and it must be made absolutely clear that throughout the course of the litigation in the summer and throughout these proceedings, you have made available, it would seem, everything in your possession. You made clear, I think, through your solicitors, however, that you had a phone which you used from May 2021, and you've made available the WhatsApps and the emails from that phone. Therefore, between May 21 and February 22, the end of the period that the inquiry was requesting about. But following a well-publicised security breach, you had not been able
Yeah.
to use to access the previous phone because you'd stopped using it and you were fearful that if you tried to access it, you'd delete its data. Is that right?
That's right.
Were you able to get access ultimately to the contents of that first phone, the old phone?
Yes, so we sent it off to some technical people and they activated it.
Was there a time gap, as your solicitors have described it, on that phone, a period between the 30th of January 2020 and June 2020, during which time the WhatsApps have not been
Yes.
capable of being reinstalled and disclosed?
That's right.
Do you know why your phone was missing those 5,000 odd WhatsApps?
I don't know the exact reason, but it looks as though it's something to do with the app going down and then coming up again, but somehow not automatically erasing all the things between that date when it went down and the moment when it was last backed up. So I can't give you the technical explanation, but that's the best I'm able to give.
The technical report that your solicitors kindly provided demonstrates that there may have been a factory reset of the phone at the end of January 2020 and then an attempt to reinstall the contents later in June 2020. May I just ask you this? Was it you, if that was a factory reset that was done, was it you that tried to reset the phone or not?
A factory reset?
There is a device or a capability on the phone which allows its contents to be entirely reset. That wasn't you.
I don't remember any such thing.
All right. And during the course of the litigation this summer, between the inquiry and the Cabinet Office, did you, of course, make plain your stated wish that the WhatsApps which were the subject of that litigation should be disclosed,
yes,
they being your own WhatsApps? All right.
Can I, for the avoidance of doubt, make it absolutely clear I haven't removed any WhatsApps from my phone, and I've given you everything that I think you need.
I ask, Mr. Johnson, because this issue has been trailed in the press.
Yeah, no, I get you.
And it's important that you have an opportunity of explaining why those WhatsApps are not available. The inquiry has absolutely no interest in the salaciousness or the nature of Mr. Cummings's linguistic style or the WhatsApps. But it does have an interest, of course, in whether or not his communications revealed an abusive and misogynistic impact. The WhatsApps and the texts shed a direct light on the competence of the government, how well or not the government machinery operated, what you all thought about each other, and what some of you thought privately about the decisions that were being taken. We're going to look in detail at them later, but it's fair to say that in the round that material paints a appalling picture, not all the time, but at times of incompetence and disarray.
Can I comment on that? I think Please. That the two things need to be separated out there. I think it is certainly true that this inquiry has, and I'm glad of it, has dredged up a phenomenal quantity of the type of material that would never have been available to any previous inquiry into doings in Number 10, because it's WhatsApp communications of a kind that would not have been possible. And that's a good thing, because you can get a texture of the feeling for the relationships and the human beings. I would make a couple of points. First of all, a lot of the language, the style that you refer to is completely unknown to me, or indeed to anybody else not on that group. I've apologised to one particular person who suffered abuse in that in one of those publicised WhatsApp exchanges. But I would make a distinction between the type of language used and the decision-making processes of the government and what we got done. And I would submit that any powerful and effective government has, and I think of the Thatcher government or the Blair government, has a lot of challenging and competing characters whose views about each other might not be fit to print, but who get an awful lot done. And that's what we did.
Your own Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sedwell, he was, of course, asked to move on, and we'll come to that later, in May 2020, described, according to Sir Patrick Vallance, your administration as brutal and useless, and observed that it was hard to motivate people in Number 10 in such terrible times if they were being shot in the back. That would appear to be a reference to the doings, as you say, of Number 10, to the process and the operation of government, as opposed to the atmospherics. Would you not agree?
Again, I think that actually what you're looking at in all this this stuff is a lot of highly talented and highly motivated people who are stricken with anxiety about what is happening, about the pandemic, who are doing their best, and who, like all human beings, under great stress and great anxiety about themselves and their own performance, will be inclined to be critical of others. And I think that would have been the same of any administration facing the same sort of challenges on that scale.
On the 27th of March, after Mr. Cummings had asserted that Whitehall had nearly killed huge numbers of people and cost millions of jobs, and that Mr. Hancock had failed to get on top of the testing problems, you yourself said these three words: totally fucking hopeless. That was a reference to the performance of an important part of government.
I'd stress the word nearly in that.
Your response, Mr. Johnson.
And I would say that my job was not uncritically to accept that everything we were doing was good, though I as it happens, as I said to you, I do think that the country as a whole had notable achievements during the crisis. My job was to try to get a load of quite disparate, quite challenging characters to keep going and through a long period, and to keep doing their level best to protect the country. That was my job.
Do you accept the evidence from Helen McNamara, about which you will be aware, and also from former Cabinet Secretaries, that Mr. Cummings himself contributed to such a toxic atmosphere that civil servants simply didn't want to work in the heart of government? Helen McNamara said the relationships in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office had a real and damaging impact. You were told directly by Simon Case on the 2nd of July, lots of top-drawer people had refused to come to work because of the toxic reputation of your, I emphasize, your operation. Were you aware that there were individuals, civil servants and advisors who were not prepared to work in your administration because of the atmosphere and the working relationships which were in play?
First of all, no. Second, I was not aware of that. Secondly, I didn't see any sign of that. I saw brilliantly talented people when we advertised for a post, when we wanted to recruit for a position in my private office. We had, as far as I could see, no difficulty getting wonderful people to step forward. I think, if I might make one self-criticism, or another self-criticism, I think that the gender balance of my team should have been better.
Could we have, please, 48313, page 16, on the screen? These are communications between Mr. Cummings and yourself in May 2020. We're concerned with the bottom half of the page.
So can you expand it, because I can't?
Yes, 7th of May, Hancock is unfit for this job. the incompetence, the constant lies, the obsession with media bullshit, reference to testing. You must ask him where we'll get to 500,000 per day and where's your plan for testing. And if you can scroll back out.
But
just,
sorry,
just pause a second, Mr. Johnson. If you then scroll in, please, to the bottom half of the page, the last part. Mr. Cummings says, it'll certainly be a cock-up like everything else, but it'll be far from the worst of our cock-ups over the next 8 weeks. You need to think of Binning Hancock, and so on and so forth. You cannot suggest that you are unaware of the opinion taken by your chief advisor over your Secretary of State for Health. You cannot suggest you are unaware of the concerns expressed by your Cabinet Secretary about the toxic reputation of your operation, because he WhatsApped you directly. You cannot suggest that there weren't grave concerns being expressed in Downing Street, that there were people who simply would not come and work for you because of the atmosphere you allowed to develop.
So, first of all, in politics, there's never a time when you're not, if you're Prime Minister, you are constantly being lobbied by somebody to sack somebody else. It's just what I'm afraid happens, and it's part of life. Everybody's constantly militating against some other individual for some reason of their own. It's just that I'm afraid that's the nature of it. It is perfectly true that this advisor in particular thought had a low opinion of the health secretary. I thought he was wrong. I stuck by the health secretary. I thought the health secretary worked very hard, and whatever, he may have had defects, but I thought that he was doing his best in very difficult circumstances, and I thought he was a good communicator.
Mr. Case refers at the top of the page to how you have told Mr. Cummings outright to stop talking to the media in his presence. This place is just insane, zero discipline. And then in the bottom half of the page, these people are so madly self-defeating. It's hard to ask people to march. It should be to the sound of gunfire. And then the Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary is the head of the civil service. Is he or she not? I've never seen a bunch of people less well equipped to run a country. That's not a matter of atmospherics or lobbying or part of the general day in, day out friction within government, is it?
Yes, I think it is. And I think that as I say, if you'd had the views of the Mandarinate about the Thatcher government in unexpurgated WhatsApps, my lady, I think you would have found that they were pretty fruity. It's WhatsApp conversation is intended to be, though clearly it isn't, ephemeral. It tends to the pejorative and the hyperbolical, and I think that the worst vice, in my view, would have been to have had an operation where everybody was so deferential and so reluctant to make waves that they never expressed their opinion, they never challenged, and they never doubted. It was much more important to have a group of people who are willing to doubt themselves and to doubt each other. And I think that was creatively useful rather than the reverse.
Some of these senior advisors didn't just lack deference, to use your word, Mr. Johnson. They doubted you, and they doubted your ability and your competence, as you now know from having seen the material. You've had this material for some time. Have you reflected on whether or not the inquiry could, if my lady sees fit, make recommendations about the way in which a character such as Mr. Cummings, about whom some extremely strong views have been expressed, should be in the position that he was, views on whether or not the Prime Minister had access to the correct and proper forms of advice? Are these not issues that you've thought about?
Yes, but I think overwhelmingly that I did have access to the correct and proper forms of advice. And if you ask upon whom I relied for that advice, it was the CMO and the CSA, together with the experts, the officials in my private office.
You lost confidence in your Cabinet Secretary in May 2020, did you not?
Well, he asked to step aside.
Did you lose confidence in your Cabinet Secretary in May 2020?
Yeah, he asked to step aside.
Regardless of the psychological issues that may have been preying on the minds of its constituent individual parts, the government failed to wake up, did it not? It failed to understand the significance of the crisis, and therefore, it must follow, failed to take steps speedily enough.
I think that it would certainly be fair to say of me, the entire Whitehall establishment, scientific community included, our advisors included, that we underestimated the scale and the pace of the challenge. And you can see that very clearly in those early days in March, from late February through to the sequence of NPIs, of lockdowns. You can see that we were all collectively underestimating how fast it had already spread in the UK. We underestimated. We put the peak too late. The first peak too late. We thought it would be in May, June. That was totally wrong. I don't blame the scientists for that at all, but that was the feeling, and it just turned out to be wrong.
But the evidence before Milady shows that the scientists, at least in part, were aware by the end of January of the hospitalisation rate, of the fact that the number of infections was being grossly underestimated, that there was self-sustaining human-to-human transmission. They were aware by the beginning of February that there was no effective test, trace, control, isolate system in the United Kingdom. So once the virus spread beyond China and became self-sustaining, there was no effective means of stopping its entry into the United Kingdom. That was all known to the scientists, at least by the beginning of February. Why wasn't it known to the
on the test, trace,
ministers?
On the test, trace and isolate, on the whole diagnostics question, I think if you look at the evidence, you can see actually that we were being assured, I was being assured that we were in a good place on that until it became clear that wasn't quite right. But
I'm asking you about the system. Forgive me. I'm asking you about the system. If the scientists knew and had the data from which the government could draw the proper conclusions, why didn't the government systemically rise up in light of these alarm bells and do something?
Well, I don't wish to say that we were oblivious, because we weren't. And actually, a lot of work went on, a lot of planning, a huge amount of discussion. So I think I'm talking quite a lot now. So I think the CMO first briefed me about it on about the 4th of February, and we talk about what could happen. SAGE, as you say, is meeting. It's not as though nothing is happening.
No,
I think that what is going wrong possibly is that we are just underestimating the pace, the contagiousness of the disease.
You have, in fact, already given evidence to the inquiry in relation to why, you suggested at an earlier stage, there were comparisons properly to be drawn with swine flu, and you've described the importance to you of not talking the economy down. The first line, he doesn't think anything can be done. may I just ask you this? This date, the 3rd of March, comes, of course, after your meeting with the Civil Contingency Secretariat. It comes after the COBRA, at which there is some early debate about measures and what can be done. And if you did say on the 3rd of March to Mr. Cummings, I don't think anything can be done, that casts a very significant light upon what you were being told around that time.
I don't think I can't say exactly what I said to my advisor, nor would I necessarily place too much reliance on his reporting of what I said. But I think my impression was at that time that, because of what we've said about borders, because of what we said about the other measures open to us, that it goes back to the questions I was asking. I couldn't see yet the plan. I couldn't see what. So the NPIs were, to me, and this is probably what Imran is getting at in his email, pretty, far-fetched still in my imagination. I was still gestating that.
At a press conference on the 3rd of March, you said that we were, as a country, extremely well prepared. Of course, as it turns out, that was not so. But I want to ask you, the weekend before, you'd received the draft action plan, the contained delay document, which you'd been shown in draft form. And in that document, there is that assertion. We are well prepared and we have plans in place, etc. Do you think you told the world that we were well prepared on the 3rd because you had seen it in that action plan, the draft of which you've been reading over the weekend?
Yes, this is the second. This is the weekend of the
28th of February, 1st of March.
29th. Was it a leap year? Was there a 29th?
I really don't know, Mr. Johnson. I can't assist you with that.
Anyway, it's certainly true that I was the general reassurances I was getting were that we were well prepared. So the scales had not yet fallen about, for instance, test and trace.
You shook hands with patients at the Royal Free Hospital on the 1st of March. You know that, of course, you were later criticised for that. May we take it that you hadn't seen, or at least you hadn't been advised of the contents of the Spy B paper of around that time? In fact, the paper came later, the 3rd of March, but advice was given generally before that, advising against greetings such as shaking hands. Did you know?
I didn't, but I do think that it was. I shouldn't have done that in retrospect, and I should have been more precautionary. But I wanted to be encouraging to people, and so I think it's on that day that I go to Colindale, to PHE, and although I've been told, sorry, this is in my statement, but although I've been told that we have a fantastic belt and braces system, I was a little bit concerned about. I had a feeling that perhaps they weren't really as across the situation as I've been led to believe.
Non-pharmaceutical interventions were debated, but they didn't include lockdown. There was a debate about extreme social distancing at the beginning of March. Lockdown doesn't appear to later.
It doesn't.
But your answer, Mr. Johnson, is I think the problem is that if you exclude borders and test and trace, is not as good as it's cracked out to be. And if you're told we've got ample supplies of PPE, I was finding it hard to conceptualise exactly what we should be doing. That debate, that realisation on your part that there is no effective border control, the PPE may be deficient, that there is no effective test and trace, scaled up test and trace, isolate contact system, is absent from all this material. That debate simply doesn't take place. There is no general realisation the virus is coming. It's a 2% fatality rate or 1% fatality rate. And we haven't got the measures in place to be able to deal with it. That debate doesn't take place.
And I think that's right. And I think it's basically for the same reason that I've given, which is that although people intellectually can see that the RWCS could happen, as Catherine Hammond puts it, they still don't think that it's very likely to happen. And that's the reality.
Mr. Johnson, in a WhatsApp to Mr. Cummings, you described him and you and your administration as having indulged in an orgy of narcissism. That's not disputatious culture, is it?
I think with respect, that WhatsApp was sent
at the end.
When I think things were becoming, some of the things that were not obvious to me had become more obvious.
48313, page 17, is a WhatsApp in May, in fact, so earlier in the summer. A WhatsApp from Mr. Cummings to you. I think it's a screenshot from Mr. Cummings's witness statement. If we could scroll into the top of the page. If Hancock texts really coming to meetings number 10, please just ignore. We urgently need to have meetings without him. That's Mr. Cummings. And then this, all too recognisable, we need to rebuild the government from top to bottom. We need to take over the Cabinet Office and run the whole thing.
Yeah, this is me on the left, is it?
Well, that was my question. The top right is obviously Mr. Cummings, because he's asking you to ignore Mr. Hancock's text, which says perhaps something about the system of
so this is...
No, just wait one moment. Is it Mr. Cummings or you who says we need to rebuild the government from top to bottom, take over the Cabinet Office and run the whole thing?
So what I'm getting at here, and what this is a reference. Is this in May?
It is the 13th of May.
Yeah. So this is a reference to a plan that we hatched to try to have a massive data-driven revolution in government.
It was part of your function as Prime Minister to ensure that the lead government department, the DHSC, was responding and dealing with the crisis as best it could. You were obliged to ensure that your government was operating properly, systemically. You knew that other advisors, senior advisors in your administration, were telling you that the DHSC was not operating well. It was chaotic and dysfunctional, and there were very real concerns being expressed about its Secretary of State. Why did you not take a grip on that issue?
Because first of all, I thought that the permanent secretary at the Department of Health, Chris Wormold, was outstanding, secondly, for the reason I repeat what I have said. I thought, in the circumstances, that Matt Hancock was doing a good job. He's he's intellectually able. He was on top of the subject, and whatever his failings may or may not have been, I didn't see any advantage to the country at a critical time to the country in moving him in exchange for someone else when I couldn't be sure that we were necessarily going to be trading up. And I did think about it. Of course I thought about it. But I thought that was the best thing to do. But what we also did was we took control, and the management of the pandemic was basically centralised in number 10.
So is this a nub of it? Throughout April, May, June, July, you were aware that a number of senior advisors and civil servants were highly critical of Mr. Hancock. You were told by Mark Sedwell around the 2nd of July that you should sack him. You were aware that he had a tendency to overpromise because you debated long and hard with Mr. Cummings the merits of what you were being told about testing. And there was a general lack of confidence that what he told you was accurate, but that you stuck by him for good or ill?
I didn't stick by him for any reason other than that I thought, on the whole, in incredibly difficult circumstances, he was doing a good job. That it was not obvious to me that the trade, that the moving him would be worth the disruption. And I also thought, which is true, that in any political environment, at some stage, somebody is always telling you to sack somebody. And that is just what I'm afraid what happens in politics. And so I had to aim off.
And the last question, please, on this. In his witness statement, Mr. Cummings says, in the summer of 2020, Mr. Johnson refused to replace Mr. Hancock despite repeated requests from me, both cabinet secretaries and many others, and being told repeatedly that leaving him there guaranteed further disasters and deaths in the autumn. His political secretary told me the Prime Minister wanted to keep Mr. Hancock as the sacrifice for the inquiry. Now, that is, of course, you may say, a piece of double hearsay, but Mr. Cummings has it in his witness statement, and therefore you need to answer it.
Well, sure. Well, I don't remember that at all, and it's nonsense. My thinking was very straightforward. I had a health secretary who was able, who was a good public communicator, in my view. I felt that whatever his defects, I wasn't clear that we were going to trade up by doing a swap. I thought it was a very, very difficult time to do that, and I wasn't persuaded by the arguments. And I don't, by the way, remember. He says both cabinet secretaries. I don't remember either of them specifically saying this, but maybe I certainly remember. There was anti-Department of Health militating. That's for sure.
On the 2nd of July, Mark Sedwell WhatsApps Simon Case and says, "I told the Prime Minister to sack Hancock to save lives and protect the NHS."
Right.
But you don't think he did?
Did you ask him about that?
Indeed.
Right. I mean, I don't remember him saying that in so many words.